really trying to understand that system. Well, a successful gamer, I see some nods in the audience, that's what you do. You're actually trying to unpack the way that game is designed in order to exploit that knowledge for later. Boy, wouldn't it be fantastic if students did that in class. And in fact, one of the greatest math educators I know, Alan Schoenfeld at Berkeley, his model of teaching is when he puts a problem up on the board, the goal is not to solve the problem. The goal is to unpack the problem. So when students present a solution to a problem, what Alan Schoenfeld says is not, okay, next problem, but okay, we've got another way we might solve that problem. Because that's the point of mathematics for him. Learning often happens with what we call affinity groups, learning communities of learners, communities of practice, but you're in it with somebody else, that's also important. And you have both intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. That's part of every good game. Somebody could get you involved, but then as you play along, you expect and hope that the reasons you're engaged switch to become something that is suiting an intrinsic goal, an internal goal of yours, and not always in response to the desire to get more points or more coins or more something. And finally, something that we call the freedom to take risks, or sometimes we call it the freedom to fail. So if there's one thing that I think is most broken with students in today's education system, it's that if you're especially successful, if you've reached a high level at an elite institution, you've probably never failed in your life. Right? You've never gotten a terrible grade, you've never botched an exam, certainly not a high-stakes exam or a test like the ACT or the SAT. And that doesn't set you up very well to do what actually leads to true success, which is to learn how to learn from the things that don't go right. So if you only get the right answers on a course all the way through, you're probably in the wrong course, let's be honest. You should be doing something harder, something where you're more likely to get things wrong often. And then the point of teaching is to support you in figuring out how to recover from those failures and how to figure out what to do wrong to do something different the next time that just might work. Another frame that my research group often applies to this kind of thinking is the very well-researched and well-understood domain of self-determination theory. It's psychological theory of motivation that takes a lot of those ideas that we were talking about in the previous slide and casts them against three core ideas: autonomy, belonging, and competence. Sometimes this is framed as competence, autonomy, and relatedness, but the same basic idea. And the notion here is that you are most intrinsically motivated when you feel that you have autonomy, you can make choices that matter, when you feel a sense of connection, and when you feel support for competence, that you don't feel like you're an idiot. And by the way, when these things are present negatively, when you do feel lost, when you feel isolated, and when you feel like you're on a rail and there's no way for you to make a choice that really is meaningful, you feel less intrinsically motivated and require more intrinsic motivation to keep going. So when your teaching embodies these attributes, that's what we call gameful. So that was a very brief overview of the ways that we think about it. And that overview was designed to help you think about what we're going to talk about in a few moments, about ways we might look at data. Let me just quickly review how this actually looks in the classroom. So if on the left you have the sort of stereotype traditional way things unfold, on the right you have the way things unfold in a gameful classroom. So you want students to feel like they have self-determination. You need to be transparent about the entire system so that people can see all the rules. Multiple pathways as opposed to you, the instructor, choosing to focus all the time. Changing the frame from what I gave you as a teacher to what you've earned as a learner. Trying to lower the cost of failure in order to incentivize progression instead of having high stakes things all the time and incentivizing avoidance. So for instance, how many of you have seen on social media or heard somebody say toward the end of the semester something like, well, I only did 130% of the final to pass this class, right? Good luck with that kid. So that's a situation in which somebody is now ready to start avoiding further work in that class because there's no more hope for them because it's not about progress, it's about something else. This is the class that was the genesis of a lot of our theoretical musings around this, a class called Video Games and Learning. Although this idea, gameful learning, is used now across dozens of classes here at the University of Michigan and by thousands of students across many different subject areas. So one of your questions is, yeah, but does this work in X? The answer is probably, because we're working with X. And it works differently in different settings. So there's a lot of variation about how this gets implemented. My class is a social science class taught in the School of Education, not people who are going to be teachers. Sad artifact of our public education system is that if you're going to be a teacher, the course requirements are so stringent that you don't have time to take a class like this. Oh well. But we have designed this class, and I say we because it's been a collaboration with a number of people over a number of years to evolve the class to a point where we felt it was performing the way we wanted it to. There's weekly work and a semester-long project that everybody more or less engages in. I try to give the idea that everything in my class is by choice, a lot of autonomy, but honestly, as an instructor, I tell them, look, these are some things that you better do because they're core to the class experience. There are various pathways students can choose through the class, so they can choose to blog, write game critiques, critiquing things against the theories we're discussing in the class. They might do a kind of deep dive on something that is challenging or that's of interest to them. There's a group project that's by choice, very important for group projects to be a choice I've discovered because students hate me so much. There's a line that one of my students shared with me. I want my project members to be my pallbearers so they can let me down one last time. And we try to establish a playful community. It's important for that sense of belonging in the class, that students feel that they are, again, part of something bigger than themselves. They understand how this works in combination with other students. And I could show you dozens of slides of different classes that would all have different arrangements of things in here, but all of which fit under that broader frame of gameful or playful or self-determination supportive frames for thinking about learning. So I mentioned earlier, it's changed for students that if you've been a very successful student, you're probably not used to thinking this way. And Kathy Davidson, a colleague now she's at CUNY, she for many years was at Duke, has this great line about how we've trained people into a certain way of just thinking about themselves as learners, what it means to be a successful learner. And that frame is GPA, test score, status of the university, all these sort of extrinsic external signals of success are what really is what really frames learning for students. So when we talk about gameful and some of the challenges for getting gameful to work for instructors, we also have to think about getting it to work for students. Because when you're doing things that are different, it's not just we that fall into loopy thinking, it's students who often fall prey to loopy thinking as well. So I'm going to turn things back over to Rachel, and we're going to think about different things that we could measure in this frame.
So here's a list of things that you could measure, and we're going to go into detail in just two of them. One of them is actually what doesn't work. So we don't want to measure simple course grade outcomes. And there's a couple reasons behind that. One is that if that is the hallmark of learning, that's antithetical to the philosophy of gameful. We just talked about how we want them to get intrinsic motivation, and the process that they go through is more important than what that final grade is. And we want them to go through a progression of activities that may be of their own choosing. The other thing we'll talk about is usage of the tools like the grade commission. But thinking about why not to start with looking at how are grades affected in gameful courses. Some questions that you might have when you're hearing about gameful learning is, do students learn more? Does gameful pedagogy decrease achievement gaps? So are some students who are privileged in the traditional system less privileged in a gameful system? And one way we might think about measuring that is with this idea of a grade anomaly. So this comes out of Tim McKay's work. Grade point average, we know from his work, is a strong predictor of student success or student achievement. So C students tend to be C students. A students tend to be A students. And when there are deviations from that, when students do better than expected or worse than expected, there's something either in their behaviors or in the environment that should be investigated to understand the difference. So we can define, this is the one and only equation that I ever use anymore, but also that we'll use today, is we can define a grade anomaly as the grade in a course, the difference between a graded course and the GPA O, and we're calling that the GPA other. So the other courses in that learning institution. So if I'm a 3.8 student, but I get a 4.0 in a course, there's a grade anomaly of 0.2. So this seems like a really great approach to think about learning. And it works in a lot of contexts, but we've discovered that it's just not useful in gameful context. And these are two different grade distributions. So on the left we have traditional, and on the right we have gameful. This is a 1-credit science course for non-majors in the astronomy department. And you can see students do really well in the traditional sense. There were 140 A's given out in that particular year. But when the course went gameful, we ended up with 250 A pluses. And we find that this grade distribution gets skewed in almost all gameful courses. Ideally, we'd like to say that they're learning more, but grades wrap up a lot of information into one-dimensional measurements. And we also know that we've given students a couple of advantages to earning a higher grade. One is that they have that recovery from failure option. So by having multiple pathways to choose, if students don't do well on an exam, they can engage in additional practice opportunities, more homeworks, revise and resubmit, something that will lead them to that higher grade. As well as the pathway is much clearer. So it's laid out at the beginning of the gameful course what they need to do to get the grade that they want. And so if we were to look at the grade anomaly for students in this course, almost all of them would have positive grade anomalies, but we have no idea whether that actually equates to learning. And so in a gameful course, we need to take a step back and say, if our traditional metrics aren't working, what can we look at and what can we measure? So if we go back to this idea of the types of learning that students are hopefully engaging in, I want to highlight metacognition as something. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, metacognition is thinking about thinking. So how do learners approach the process of learning? And one way we can think about that is looking at grade predictor usage and the predictions that students make. So this work that I'm going to talk about is all out of a LAC paper from LAC 15 by Kate Holman, Stephen Aguilar, Adam Levick, and other members of the Berries group. And so you can see the visuals that go along with this, but I want to talk a little bit about the questions that we were asking. So how frequently are students using the predictor? Is there any relationship between when they receive feedback and when they look at the predictor? So once students get a grade, do they say, oh, I did better or worse than I thought I did? Let's see what I need to do. What we actually found in the data is that they don't necessarily look at it when they get their feedback. They look at it on the due dates of major assignments, implying that they're saying, oh, that went better than I thought, or that did go as well as I thought, I better plan out, but not using the predictor based on actual data. So how accurate are the predictions? Is there any relationship between final course grade and whether the learner generally over-predicts their scores or under-predicts their scores? So when we look at the types of predictions that people make, we find that very strong students tend to under-predict their score using the grade predictor. They're more cautious, and they're making sure that they can get the grade that they want. Whereas less metacognitively skilled students are often over-predicting, and they end up with a lower final grade because they haven't accounted or planned for the opportunity to fail that they ended up taking advantage of. And then are there students who do well on an assignment, though not as well as they predicted, and choose to revise and resubmit? So this could give us an insight into what kind of students wants or how intrinsically motivated a student is. So, and this isn't something that we've necessarily looked at yet, but if students are doing well by some objective measure of achievement, but they're still choosing to revise and resubmit, that's something that indicates they are really engaged in the work being presented to them. So right now, you have the ball? I'll grab the ball.
All right, so here's your turn. So we spent a significant amount of time sharing what we mean by gameful, but that's just one alternative. So we are now inviting you to think from your own experience, or if you want to think about gameful, that's great. To think about a learning activity you participated in that you think is not the usual, but that you believe you learned something from. Briefly, just jot down, because we want you to be able to share it cogently with people around you, how you thought about that activity, what it meant to you, so how you would define it. And then one or more, but not very many, for the interest of time, metrics that you might use if somebody said to you, well, you say you learned something, how prove it, right? What would show that you had learned that thing? Or something else, maybe it's not necessarily about learning broadly defined, but something else that you took away. Think about the 21st century skills diagram. And then we want you to turn to people in your intermediate area and think about that. And then, in order to facilitate sharing, we're going to throw something at you. But we'll come back to it. I first want you to go back to think about learning, right? So maybe you don't always think about learning, but now we want you to for a couple of minutes. And then when we come back around, we will play ball. And if you want to know what this is, you have to earn it by coming up with some good ideas to share. So we'll come around and we'll facilitate this and come back.
Okay, let's come back together as a large group. Play ball first.
Time to find out what's in the box.
You haven't figured it out yet. Who wants to play ball first? No volunteers, I'll just throw this at someone.
I thought this was going to be heavy. Oh, wow, isn't that cool?
That's right. That's what's in the box.
That's
you
what's
guys
in the
are
box,
in the
a
box.
microphone. Okay, so we were talking about, of course, different learning activities, and I think the one Abdel had an interesting approach that he does in his classroom. I kind of took it a different approach to something very basic and how I learned to play frisbee golf or disc golf. And I learned, my father taught me, and it was playing with him out there on the golf course, and kind of an apprenticeship idea, if you will. And then, some kind of metrics of how I learned that, or good indicators that I learned. One thing I said was that I'm able to teach somebody else how to play disc golf now. Abdel pointed out that one of the things my dad did was he would tweak my approach or my different ways I did things along the way, or I would recognize, I need to learn how to throw a rollie. Can you show me how to do that kind of thing? So tweaking that and that awareness of, that I was changing my approach to that. And then I think finally using the vocabulary. So using the vocabulary of disc golf, of the scoring and the birds and the Anheisers and this sort of thing.
And that's interesting because disc golf, of course, has an objective way to measure competency too, right? Which is
right.
How do you score in the actual game? But you chose to do something beyond, which is nice. All right, why don't you throw the box over that away? We just have to make sure it doesn't end up in the balcony because we don't have access to the balcony. Go ahead.
Microphone, sorry. Okay, so I was thinking about the use of a grade predictor as maybe somewhat in contrast to the goal of intrinsic motivation in a way, because the grades are fundamentally an extrinsic motivator. So I was thinking about other ways to really, cultivate intrinsic motivation in a games for learning class with undergraduates, and being out of the sort of constructionist camp myself and working with game design curriculum and Global Aurea, I thought about how you could actually have the students themselves in the undergraduate program create games and use as metrics for assessment or evaluation of their learning, like peer playing of the game, and it wouldn't even have to necessarily be a functioning product. It could be a prototype or something like that. And I have peer feedback or player feedback go into the assessment of whether the students themselves have learned principles for games for learning.
Lots of different frames. And happy to, by the way, engage over lunch in conversations about
the philosophy of gameful, because there are lots of different ways you can nudge it that
Can we do a
could go
relay?
well or poorly.
Here.
So have confidence in yourselves, folks. Throw it. It actually has a built-in motion sensor that if it hits the ground, it cuts off the mic.
Well, it hit the ground, so
Well-designed tech.
you can still hear me. Hello, I'm JD Freeman. I'm principal data scientist with Unison. You heard Dr. Hilton talk about Unison in his speech. The experience I wanted to share with you was a high school experience of mine in a sociology class. We played a board game, famous board game called Ghetto. And this board game is intended to simulate the conditions of the socioeconomically oppressed. And the teacher let us play this board game for the entire session, and only at the end did she reveal to us that it is, by design, impossible to succeed at this game unless you cheat. So metrics are, did you succeed? What portion of the cohort succeeded? What order did you succeed in? Meaning, did competition dynamics drive people to finally cheat, even because they perceived they were falling behind? And whether or not you denied that you cheated, even though you were caught red-handed. Because the ultimate lesson that one learned from this game was not the rules of the game, it was that it was impossible to get ahead unless you defined the rules.
That's a great set of way to turn it on its head for the star students who are used to getting it. That's sort of the Kobayashi Maru test, really, isn't it?
It is, and I was that star student that
Yeah.
cheated and then denied cheating.
Nice. Awesome.
Ridiculously so.
Who thinks they have another very different frame on learning that would really change things? So let's give it your best baseball toss over there. Yeah. Woo.
Well, I don't know if it's that different, but it was experience in the Vatican Museum in Rome, and so it would be, in that kind of situation. We were there actually doing a research project, and we were looking at how they were using mobile technologies to support tours around the museum and things like that. So what was interesting was that it generated a lot of discussion among those of us working with that. We were looking at how they were using so it was the engagement, I could say what the metrics could be was the social engagement of you with the people you're with, the discourse you get between you. The second would be the use of, you could call them the learning tools, the audio they had, the descriptions on the visual artifacts and things like that. But then also when we talked about when you walk into the Sistine Chapel and you just get that aha, the experience of, so your own reaction, your emotional reaction to something that you encounter, for instance.
It's interesting to me how informal learning presents, not faced with the same requirements. For instance, to have a 200 level experience at the Vatican, to follow up with your 100 level experience, we respond with very different design goals.
Exactly.
And so I feel like that's another challenge for us to think about in higher education is what are the trailing experiences that we expect we're preparing people for? So it's a good one. Over here. This may be. So Paul Resnick loaned us this. He's a colleague of ours in the School of Information, and he uses this in his large coding class. And he had to design the way he used this. At first, I think he told us it was he throws it and if you catch it, you have to answer a question. But that was a poor incentive.
People would disperse.
People scatter, right. So I think he changed the way that works.
So our group talked about a couple of different instructional techniques, like a jigsaw kind of approach. But I actually had an experience when I was in high school, and the fact that I still remember it 30 years later, it tells you something about the power of it, which was the teacher at the time, was a social studies teacher, lived on a military base at the time, so she had done this for many years, but a scavenger hunt. And so the idea is that she had planted clues about his historical event across all different places in the base, some of which I had never been to before. And you worked in a small group trying to find those clues and piece together the historical event. So you could look at the clues that were found, the inferences that were made, the historical inferences that were made. You were also supposed to then go do research about it and look at the handwriting and try to match those things up with other known. So I don't remember at all the historical event. I remember what it was like to be a historian.
So that's
and I
beautiful.
thought that was, and 30 years later, I still remember it.
And that's really in that John Seeley Brown learning to become frame, right? Where the key is not like anybody could. Well, I often, maybe you've heard this phrase too. If you can Google the answer, it's not a good question. And so a lot of the way we teach history still is about, especially in high school, is that are things that could be looked up, as opposed to learning how to think like an historian, which is really a different challenge. It's very cool. We can also open up for general questions, by the way, about this notion of loopy learning analytics, and also gameful learning as a sort of, we hope, a thinking vehicle for getting out of that loop. I'm also aware that we're between you and lunch. Anyone else want the ball?
All right. I'm going to try and form this question in a coherent manner. I'm a little bit concerned about part of our motivation for, let's say, collaborative learning and group projects as a thing. And part of the reason why we as instructors do group projects is because it gives us slightly less to grade. And we say also there's other soft skills that you learn here. You learn leadership, you learn to collaborate, which is very important for the rest of your life. But I would suspect that the less grading is why we actually assign it in the end. And so I'm a little bit concerned about when you make things like small group projects optional or other kinds of skills that students are just never going to choose to do them. And we only have them as assignments because it sort of helps us, and we say it's also because of these soft skills. So I'm kind of wondering how, like, if I never do the ambulance driving task and I never learn to drive an ambulance in the game, it doesn't matter. But in life, and I never learn to do group work, what is that?
That's an excellent question, but it's a design question, right?
Right.
So it's up to you what you want to require students to do or not do in your class.
Mm-hmm.
The question for me is, what are their pathways? So to me, autonomy doesn't mean, woo, free-for-all. Autonomy, though, is about giving people the ability to make choices that matter.
Mm-hmm.
And I often use as an example from my own life, and maybe from many of your lives, the dressing a toddler exercise, right? Or maybe a first or second grader. If you say, what do you want to wear tomorrow? Complete autonomy, that's a nightmare for everybody. If you say, do you want to wear this outfit or that outfit, that's carefully curated autonomy. It's really just the perception of autonomy, but that is almost as good, and then everybody wins. And in class too, if you want I think the real challenge in gameful design is to be very explicit about what your learning objectives are for the experience, and then to make sure that no matter what pathway students choose through the experience, by the end you're satisfied that everybody has accomplished this. Now, nobody asked what I thought would be the first question, which is 258 pluses. What the hell, people? Which is the obvious question, right? You have that question? Okay, that's a fair question. Yes. So, okay, let me say, I have something to say about that, but before I do, this is the class we showed you is actually a one-credit elective in science, fairly popular class. The topic is aliens, but I've had other experiences. So one of my favorite emails that I have preserved in Arbor is from my dean, who used this approach to teach a class, and he wrote me and said, well, I'm really sorry to tell you that way too many students, many more students than I expected, got A's in this class. And the reason is they just worked way harder than I expected. I was like, I could live with that, right? That's kind of a high-class problem. As long as he believes, and this is where we're working, this is about iteration and design, that the students who earn the A's deserve the A's, right? That they actually walked out of the room knowing the things that the instructor thought were worth knowing. About the grade distribution policies, so a bedrock rule for me in gameful learning is no curves. Because first it rations outcomes in a way that doesn't necessarily reflect learning, and second, it masks learning. So what does it mean when a student, so I had a B school student in my class last semester. We were talking about curves and why I am not in favor of curves. He said, yeah, like last semester I had 2 classes in the B school. In one of them, my average was a 94, and I got a B minus in that class. And in the other, my average was a 74, and I got a B plus in that class. So I don't even know what I know. And that's true, right? Those policies, and again, I understand they exist, right? And sometimes part of what we're doing is having a deep conversation with the authority in order to talk about what learning should be and how we might measure learning. But to me, the enforced B plus or enforced B is hiding all kinds of other information. And from one of the earlier conversations we heard about learning analytics and personalization was, gee, wouldn't it be nice if a person in a 200 level class knew exactly what everybody coming out of the 100 level class knew and could do, and then we could help personalize and customize the instruction content of that 200 level class to pick up where people were leaving from the 100 level class, instead of knowing that the average student had a B plus. But I don't know what 15% of the content, assuming a perfect curve distribution out of 100%, they were missing. But it is the obvious question, so thank you for
Well, and
asking.
I would assert that it's not just the curve that masks information, but the grades that we give, in fact, mask an enormous amount of information about learning. So there was another hand over back here.
You want the box? Let's throw the box.
Oh, yeah, that's okay.
No, we like throwing the box.
You're welcome to throw it. I have to be loud.
It's also soft. It's unlikely to hurt anybody.
So squishy, I love it. I had a question about your results about students predicting their grades and the under predictors and over predictors, and just thinking about this larger idea of context and the environment that students learn in. So I was wondering about the outliers, the students who are good at predicting their grades. What's going on there? How do we help them be good at predicting their grades?
So I think the question is less, do they need to be good at predicting their grades, or do they need to be good at assessing how well they've learned?
Sure.
And so, again, there's this weird, we're assuming that grades actually are telling us something about the learning, which is why I actually find it really interesting that learners don't choose to go back to the predictor when they get feedback, but they're choosing to go to it when they've got their own self-assessment of their performance. And so I think in terms of how do we help students build those metacognitive skills, there's a number of techniques out in the literature in terms of, reflecting on it, reflecting on how you went about learning, which of your strategies was most effective, what will you do differently in the next iteration of this kind of assignment.
So like the ones that were better predictors, were they doing those things?
We actually don't know.
Yeah.
So, but I think that's sort of a meta level, Tim's work, we often call it the Better Than Expected project that helped create one of the tools that's currently in the greenhouse. And, but this would be a better than expected metacognitive assessment. And that would actually, focus groups were involved in figuring out what were the approaches students were taking when they did better than expected.
Yeah.
I think a similar pilot would have to be put in play to see who's doing better than expected metacognitively.
Yeah. Neat.
Okay, you are between us and lunch. So this is the last time we're together as a group today. We'll reconvene here tomorrow morning again at 9 for keynotes and panels and a check-in hopefully from what's going on at one of the other LASIs. And you'll go off to your workshops for the afternoon. We provided, I think everyone should know where you're going in terms of which workshop you're in. If not, check with Katie at the table. There have been distribution about room names and room numbers, and there's a map on that Google site if you've used that. And there are ways to find out where you need to be. But meanwhile, lunch is straight down the hall in the beautiful ballroom of this building. Help yourselves enjoy, maybe get outside for a few minutes for a breath of fresh air, and convene back at your workshop. Thank you.